My mechanic charged me $3,000 for imaginary engine repairs and refused to release my car. He froze when my uncle, the state's chief consumer fraud investigator, walked in with a tow truck. Denny's hands were clean. That was the first thing that snagged wrong in my head standing at that particle board counter. A man who claimed he'd spent 4 hours elbow deep in my long block had knuckles like he'd just come from a manicure. No grease worked into the creases of his palms, no black under the nails. He slid a repair order across the counter with a total circled twice in red pen, $3,014 through $60, and told me the truck wasn't leaving his lot until I paid it in full or signed a release acknowledging the diagnosis and waiving any further dispute. It was 2:40 on a Tuesday. The shop smelled like burnt coffee and tire rubber, and somewhere in the back bay, an impact wrench was firing off in short, confident bursts, the sound of a place that looked very busy doing something. I had a 7 o'clock shift at Cedar Grove Medical Center, $340 in my checking account until Friday, and a 7-year-old who needed picking up by 6:45 whether my truck existed or not. I didn't know yet that a single 12-digit part number typed onto that invoice, PN 12586797, was going to be the reason a state investigator's file finally closed after 4 months open. I just knew the man behind the counter had my keys, and he wasn't giving them back. I signed nothing that day. That decision would matter more than I understood at the time. I'd been bringing cars to shops in this town for 11 years, and never once had a problem I couldn't talk my way out of, which is probably why I didn't smell this one coming until it had both hands around my throat. I'm a respiratory therapist at Cedar Grove, 6 months in, still on the 90-day introductory clock, the kind of probationary status where the offer letter uses phrases like "at will," and you try not to think about what that means until you have to. I work nights, mostly the ICU step-down unit, and I drive a 2014 Silverado with 118,000 miles on it that exists in my life for exactly one purpose: getting my daughter, Nadia, to her grandmother's by 6:45 on the nights I work, and back home again by 7 the next morning, me smelling like hospital soap and the bad coffee from the third-floor break room. Route 9. Auto had 4.5 stars everywhere I checked, a waiting room with a coffee machine that actually dispensed coffee instead of brown water, and an owner named Denny Kessler who remembered my name the second visit, which I registered as good service and not, as I'd eventually learn, a habit built around remembering exactly which customers paid cash, carried no extended warranty, and never asked a follow-up question twice. I dropped the truck off on a Thursday morning describing accurately a low knock under acceleration, no warning lights, no smoke, nothing dramatic. Denny walked around it once, let it idle maybe 90 seconds with the hood up, and told me it sounded like the bottom end was going. He said he'd call with a full diagnosis by afternoon. Nadia's booster seat was still buckled into the back when I handed over the keys, 2 crackers wedged into the cup holder the way she leaves them. I remember thinking I should have vacuumed that out before the shop guys saw it and judged me for it. A small, useless thing to remember. I remember it anyway, the way you remember the shape of a doorway right before you walk through it into something else. I trusted the shop the way you trust anything with enough stars next to it and an owner who says your name back to you like it means something. That's the entire extent of my due diligence, and I want to be honest about that up front, because everything that follows started with me handing my keys to a stranger and not thinking twice about it. Thursday afternoon, Denny called and told me the engine needed a full long block replacement, the whole lower half of the motor, a remanufactured unit, $3,014, $62 out the door. No warranty coverage available because mine had lapsed 4 months back. I told myself that tracked. I hadn't been great about paperwork since the divorce, and $3,000 for a blown engine sounded in the moment exactly like the kind of number bad luck produces. I asked when I could pick it up. He said Tuesday. I told myself Tuesday was fine, even though it wasn't, because I had 4 shifts between now and then and a bus system that doesn't run before 5 in the morning. I called back Friday and asked, mostly because some instinct told me it was a thing you were supposed to ask, whether I could have the old part back, the piece they'd actually pulled out of my engine. Denny didn't hesitate. Already went out with the core return, he said. Standard once the reman's installed. Nothing left to give you. I didn't know at the time that most shops hold a pulled part in a labeled bin for 30 days minimum, specifically so a customer can ask that exact question and get a straight answer. I just felt a small, cold pull low in my stomach, told myself it was probably standard practice, and let it go. Shops did things their own way. I didn't know any better yet. Tuesday came, and the truck wasn't ready. Neither was Thursday, when Denny told me over the phone they were still buttoning up some sensor wiring, a phrase that meant nothing to me, and I'd later learn meant nothing to anyone, because you don't rewire sensors during a long block swap unless something else entirely has gone sideways. I sat in that waiting room drinking the actually real coffee, scrolling my phone out of boredom more than suspicion, and pulled up the dealer app tied to my truck's VIN, the one that logs every warranty service ever performed at any authorized dealership, the one I hadn't opened in over a year. There it was, in plain type, dated 14 months earlier, long block assembly, replaced under powertrain warranty, mileage at time of service, 94,211. My My current mileage, 118,004. Less than 24,000 miles on an engine that was supposedly knocking itself apart from ordinary wear. I read it 4 times. My hands weren't steady enough to hold the phone still on the first 2 passes. A 14-month-old long block doesn't develop rod knock from normal driving, not without a catastrophic event, and there'd been no catastrophic event, no accident, no ignored oil light, nothing. I walked up to the counter and asked Denny, as evenly as I could manage, how a 14-month-old engine ends up needing a full replacement. He looked at me 1 second too long before answering, said sometimes Riemann parts from other shops run lower quality, that whoever done the warranty work probably cut corners, that he could show me the bad bearings himself if I wanted proof. I said I did. He said they were already boxed for the core return. Again. That night, lying awake next to a phone I couldn't stop refreshing, I did what anyone with a bad feeling and no expertise does. I searched how to tell if an engine was actually replaced. The second result mentioned something called a torque seal sticker, a small painted marker mechanics apply across a fastener after final torque, so that if the bolt ever gets touched again, the seal visibly cracks. I didn't fully understand what I was reading. I filed it away the way you file away a fact that feels like it might matter someday, without knowing yet how. The next morning I asked, casually, if I could take a look at the engine bay myself before pickup, just to see it, I said. No reason. Denny told me the truck was up on the lift mid-reassembly, and it wasn't safe to have customers in the bay. I didn't push. I had no idea, standing there, that I was asking to look at the one piece of physical evidence that would eventually end this whole thing. I called my credit card company that night after Nadia was asleep and disputed the 2014 $60 charge as goods not received, attaching a screenshot of the warranty record and 3 paragraphs I rewrote twice before sending. The rep told me disputes like this typically take 30 to 45 days to process, and the funds would sit provisionally held with the merchant in the meantime. Denny found out before I told him. His card processor must have flagged it automatically and called me himself the next morning, his voice carrying an edge under the friendliness that hadn't been there before. He told me that under the state's garage keeper statute, if payment wasn't resolved within 10 business days of a completed repair, he had the legal right to file a mechanic's lien and send the vehicle to auction to recover his costs. He said it like he was doing me a favor by warning me ahead of time. I looked the statute up that night in the break room at Cedar Grove between patients, standing under the fluorescent lights with my badge still clipped to my scrubs, and it was real. Mechanics' liens are real. Auctions are real. 10 business days felt like nothing at all when I counted it out on my fingers. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hospital food. I had a truck sitting in a stranger's lot that I might legally lose over an engine repair I no longer believed had happened, and a clock running that I hadn't agreed to and couldn't stop. Without the truck, I missed 2 shifts in 11 days. Once because the earliest bus to Cedar Grove doesn't run before 5, and I couldn't make a 6 a.m. handoff. Once because Nadia's grandmother's ride fell through, and there was no version of that morning where I got my daughter to school and myself to work at the same time. Cedar Grove's attendance policy during the introductory period isn't forgiving. I knew that walking in. I just hadn't pictured the thing that broke it being a car repair I never asked for. Denise Okonkwo, the respiratory care director, 16 years running that department, the woman who'd hired me herself and who I genuinely liked, called me into her office on a Wednesday and slid a form across the desk with the words, attendance concern, and introductory period review typed at the top. She wasn't cruel about it. If anything, she looked tired, like she'd had some version of this exact conversation with somebody else that same week. I believe you about the car, she told me, folding her hands on top of the form like she wanted it to stop existing. I do, but I can't write car trouble on something that determines whether you keep this job, Malik. I need something I can actually use. Documentation. Anything. I didn't have anything to give her yet. Just a warranty screenshot on my phone and a bad feeling I couldn't turn into paperwork. I sat in my car in the Cedar Grove parking garage after that meeting for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive. Well, before Denise's coworker gave me a ride since I still didn't have the truck. And I remember thinking with real clarity that I could just pay the 2014 or 62s, put it on a second card, make it go away, get the truck back, keep the job, deal with feeling cheated later, quietly, the way you deal with most things that go wrong and don't have an easy fix. It would have been so much simpler to just sign. I actually drove out to Route 9 that same afternoon, catching a ride from a coworker on her way home, fully intending to do exactly that. Denny had the release printed and waiting before I even finished explaining why I'd come, like he'd known I'd fold eventually and just needed to be patient. It was 1 page, a paragraph of dense text acknowledging the shop's diagnosis and waiving any right to dispute it further, and a signature line with a small red arrow sticker pointing at it. He slid a pen across the counter with the cap already off. Smart, he said, not unkindly. Sometimes it's just easier to move forward. My hand was actually on the pen. I remember the weight of it, cheap plastic chewed slightly at the cap, when my phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from my uncle that just said, "Did you sign anything yet?" Sent for no reason I could explain except that he apparently knew me better than I knew myself that week. I told Denny I needed to reread it at home first. He didn't didn't love that answer, but there wasn't much he could say to it without sounding like exactly what he was. I called my Uncle Winston that Friday night mostly to vent, not to ask for help. He's my mother's younger brother, and he'd worked for the state attorney general's office for as long as I could remember, though I'd honestly never asked what that meant day-to-day beyond fraud stuff, the kind of vague family job knowledge you carry your whole life without curiosity. I told him everything. The knock, the invoice, the warranty record, the missing part, the torque seal thing I didn't fully understand, the lien threat, the attendance form on Denise's desk. I expected sympathy and maybe a lawyer's name. What I got was a long pause on the line, long enough that I asked if he was still there. Route 9, he said slowly. Off Baymont, past the tire place. Yeah, Denny Kessler own it? I hadn't said the owner's name. I'm sure of that, because I remember the cold jolt that went through me when he said it back to me before I'd offered it. How do you know that? Because that shop's already sitting in a file on my desk, he said. Has been for going on 4 months. I need you to email me that warranty screenshot tonight, Malik. And don't sign anything Denny gives you. Not a release, not a waiver, nothing with your name on it. Not until I call you back. I told him about the second card, about how close I'd come that afternoon to just paying it to make the whole thing stop. He was quiet for a second. I'm glad you didn't, he said. I need you to hold out a little longer. I know that's easy for me to say from my desk and hard for you to actually do. The uncle, Winston Adeyemi, has spent 22 years as an investigator in the State Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division, and I learned more about what that job actually involved in the next 3 weeks than I had in the previous 30 years of being related to him. Route 9. Otto had 11 prior complaints on file already, stretching back nearly 2 years. Customers alleging phantom repairs, refused part returns, invoices that ballooned once a car was already up on the lift, and hard to pull out without paying something. None of it alone had been enough to move on. Auto repair fraud is famously difficult to prosecute because a mechanic's diagnosis is legally treated as an opinion, and opinions are hard to disprove in a courtroom. What the division needed was documentation that turned a lie into a provable fact instead of one person's word against another's. My warranty record, time-stamped, dealer-issued, mileage logged, was the first thing in the whole file that didn't depend on anybody's memory or credibility. It was just data. Assistant Attorney General Priya Malhotra, 9 years into a career built almost entirely around prosecuting consumer fraud, took the file over formally within the week. She explained it to me plainly on the phone, in the clipped, patient tone of someone used to walking frightened people through unfamiliar processes. With my record in hand, the division had enough for a targeted subpoena of Route 9's invoicing and parts purchasing systems. Not a fishing expedition, a specific one, built around a single part number. My repair order listed the installed part as PN 12586797, a remanufactured long block assembly. If Denny's actual supplier purchase orders showed he'd bought that exact part in a fraction of the quantity he'd billed to customers across his invoicing history, that stopped being an opinion. That was arithmetic, and arithmetic holds up in court. It took 3 weeks to get the subpoena executed. In that window, a forensic auditor named Renee Castellano, 12 years with the state's financial crimes unit, worked through 18 months of Route 9's purchase orders against its customer invoices, line by line, part number by part number. What she found, Priya told me over the phone in a voice trying hard to stay professionally flat and not quite managing it. PN 12586797 had been billed to customers more than 40 times in 18 months. Route 9's actual purchase records from its supplier showed 6 units bought in that entire window. 6 units. 41 invoices eventually once the audit widened. The same fabricated repair, recycled onto whoever walked through the door paying cash or without an extended warranty, complicated enough to invite a second look, the customer statistically least likely to push back, because pushing back meant proving a negative against a man in a clean uniform shirt who said rod knock and bottom end with total practiced confidence. I wasn't unique. I was just the one who happened to have a warranty app I hadn't deleted and an uncle who happened to already have the file open on his desk. Priya walked me through what would eventually happen to my own paperwork in that process. Mostly, I think, so I'd stop calling her office twice a day out of nerves. My warranty screenshot became Exhibit B in the case file. The repair order became Exhibit A. Every document that came in after that, the subpoenaed purchase orders, Renee's audit spreadsheet, the 11 prior complaints, got logged into an evidence chain of custody with a timestamp and an initialed handoff so that nothing Denny's attorney could later claim had been altered or mishandled along the way. She told me this in the same even voice she used for everything, like she was describing how mail gets sorted, and somehow that flatness did more to calm me down than any reassurance would have. Priya explained later, and I only fully understood this after the settlement, reading a local business page article that quoted people who'd known him for years, that Denny hadn't started Route 9 as a con. He'd opened a second location 18 months before I ever brought my truck in, expanded too fast on a bank loan he was underwater on within a year, and started what a former employee described to a reporter as smoothing margins on the original shop's invoices to cover the second location's losses, one recycled part number at a time, telling himself the whole way that nobody was really being hurt, that everyone everyone overpays for car repairs anyway, that he'd make it right once the second shop turned a corner it never turned. I don't say that to excuse him. I say it because it was true, and because it made the whole thing feel less like a monster story and more like what it actually was. An ordinary man who decided, invoice by invoice, that other people's money was an acceptable place to hide from his own bad math. None of that made the 10 business days on my lien threat disappear, though. Denny called twice that week, friendlier each time in a way that felt worse than anger would have, telling me he hated for it to come to this, that he'd work with me if I just came in and signed the release, acknowledging the diagnosis and waiving further dispute, and he'd knock $400 off as a goodwill gesture. I told him I needed a few more days. He told me the auction paperwork filed automatically at day 10, no matter what either of us wanted, like it was some force of nature moving through both of us equally, and not a threat he was choosing to make. I didn't sign anything. For maybe the first time in my adult life, I did exactly what I was told without arguing about it, and it turned out to be the single most important thing I did in this whole story. Day 9 landed on a Thursday, and that same morning I found out Cedar Grove had scheduled my 90-day review for the following Monday, the meeting where Denise would either extend my offer or she wouldn't, with 2 missed shifts and the word concerns already typed onto a form I hadn't seen the rest of. By my own count, I had roughly 18 hours before Route 9 could legally file for an auction on a truck that still had my daughter's booster seat bolted into the back of it, and about 4 days before a meeting that would decide whether I kept the job I needed in order to make the truck payments in the first place. Both clocks were running at once, and neither of them cared about the other. I called Priya twice that day. The first time, she told me the subpoena results were solid, but the division still needed a formal recovery order from a judge before anyone could legally intervene in my specific vehicle situation. Probable cause on paper isn't the same as a badge with legal authority behind it, and courts don't move at the speed of a garage keeper's 10-day clock. The second call, 4 hours later, she told me Judge Miriam Alvarez, 11 years on the bench, had reviewed the forensic audit that afternoon and signed off. There was now a recovery order tying my specific vehicle to an active fraud investigation, meaning law enforcement could take physical custody of it regardless of any lien Denny tried to file first. When? I asked, and heard my own voice do something I wasn't proud of. Tomorrow morning, she said. Your uncle's handling it personally. He asked me to tell you 9 o'clock, and not to say one word to Denny before then. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark running through every version of tomorrow that ended badly. A filing error, a delay, Denny somehow moving the truck overnight, some version of 9 a.m. where I showed up and there was nothing left to recover. Around midnight, I drove past Route 9 myself, slow just to see the lot from the road, headlights off as I coasted by like I was the one doing something wrong. The Silverado was still there, parked in the same spot it had sat in for 3 weeks, a shape I recognized even in the dark by the crack in the windshield catching the streetlight. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't been. Nadia asked at breakfast why I looked like I hadn't slept, and I told her I had a big meeting, which wasn't exactly a lie. She handed me half her toast without being asked, the way 7-year-olds do when they can tell something's wrong and don't have words for it yet, only gestures. Winston Adeyemi walked into Route 9 Auto at 8:59 a.m., wearing a plain gray suit instead of anything official looking, which somehow made it worse. No badge on display, just a folder in one hand and a state ID clipped to his jacket pocket, and behind him, easing into the lot, a flatbed with state recovery unit stenciled across the door. Denny looked up when the bell over the door rang, and I watched, from where I'd parked across the lot in my mother's car, the exact moment his face went from customer service pleasant to something else entirely. Not panic yet, just the look of a man doing math he badly didn't want to be doing. Denny Kessler, my uncle said, sliding the folder onto the counter. I've got a state recovery order for a 2014 Silverado, repair order 4471. I need you to walk me to it. Denny's first move was the one I'd have predicted from a man with something to hide and no better options. He reached for the same script he'd used on me, garage keeper statute, liability waivers, his voice climbing half an octave higher than I'd ever heard from him. My uncle let him get about 4 sentences into it before cutting him off, flat and entirely unbothered, the voice of someone who'd clearly stood in this exact spot with a different Denny before. Denny tried once more, quieter, almost reasonable. Something about margins, about a second location that never should have opened, about how every shop in town rounds up a little and nobody ever calls it what my uncle was about to call it. My uncle didn't argue with any of it. He just let the sentence run out of road on its own. You can read the order, he said, or you can keep talking. Either way, the truck's leaving with us today. Then he asked the question that mattered most, the one I hadn't thought to ask myself. Show me the part you pulled, the long block. I'd like to see it before we tow the vehicle. Denny said it was already sent out for core return. Of course he did. He'd told me the same thing twice already, and I think some part of him genuinely believed it still worked as an answer, that saying it with enough confidence had always made it true before. Convenient, my uncle said, and opened the folder. Your supplier's shipping records, which we subpoenaed 3 weeks ago, show 6 units of that part number purchased in 18 months. Your invoicing system shows 41 customers billed for it in the same window. So either you've built the most efficient recycling program in the automotive industry, or nobody ever pulled any anything out of this man's truck at all. Something in Denny's shoulders dropped, his whole posture deflating in real time in a way I hadn't expected to actually watch happen to another person. He didn't say anything for a long moment, then quieter, almost to himself, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone 20 years older than him. The torque seal's still on it, original sticker, we never broke it. He said it like a confession, which I understood a half-second later, standing there remembering a phrase I'd half-read on my phone at 1 in the morning 3 weeks earlier. It was, a torque seal sticker breaks the moment a mechanic actually opens a fastener to do real work on it. His was intact. Nobody had ever touched my long block. There had never been anything wrong with my truck at all. Not a rod knock, not a bad bearing, not one true word on that entire repair order. My uncle nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected, and told Denny that refusing to produce a part he'd twice claimed to have removed on a vehicle now under an active recovery order put him one step from an obstruction charge stacked directly on top of the fraud counts already building against him, and that releasing the truck right now, undamaged, was the only version of this morning that didn't end with him in handcuffs before lunch. Denny walked us to the bay himself, hands shaking now instead of clean. My truck sat exactly where it had for 3 weeks. Same crack in the windshield, same faded parking permit, Nadia's booster seat still buckled in the back, 2 crackers gone soft in the cup holder. They released it to me on the spot. My car dispute closed within the week for a full refund. I never needed the mechanic's lien fought in any court, or the auction stopped by anyone. The truck came home with me that same morning, keys in my hand by 20 to 10. The forensic audit didn't stop at my invoice, and that turned out to be the part of this that actually mattered beyond my own driveway. Rene Castellano's numbers on a single part number opened the door to a full audit of Route 9's records going back 3 years, and by the time the state formally charged Denny 6 weeks later, 23 counts of consumer fraud, plus the obstruction charge from that morning at the bay. Investigators had identified 41 separate customers billed for a repair that had never happened, most of them people who'd paid cash, most of them people who'd never thought to check a warranty app or had an uncle who happened to run fraud investigations for a living. A local business reporter picked up the arraignment off the court docket, and within days the comment section under the article filled up with people who'd used Route 9 over the years, some of them describing the exact same phrase, the bottom end's going, used on 3 different engines that, it turned out, had never been touched either. Denny was arraigned and released on a $25,000 bond with conditions barring him from operating any repair business pending trial. His attorney negotiated a settlement months later requiring full refunds to every one of the 41, and Priya told me, sounding for once genuinely pleased on the phone instead of just professional, that the division had adopted my repair order, number 4471, part number 125886797, as an internal training example for how one customer's ordinary paperwork can crack open a pattern nobody could have proven any other way. I brought the recovery order and the refund confirmation to Cedar Grove the following Monday, to what was supposed to be my 90-day review. Denise read it twice, then closed the attendance folder in front of her without opening it again and told me the flag was gone, effective immediately, and that she was sorry it had taken paperwork from a state investigator for anyone to believe something I'd told her was true from the start. Denny never did release anything else as far as I know. Not another car under a false diagnosis, not an apology I ever heard about, not a single honest word to the 40 other people who trusted his 4.5 stars before someone with a warranty app and a well-placed uncle finally walked through his door. I drove out of that lot a few minutes past 10 that morning with Nadia's booster seat still buckled in the back, and the check engine light, which I realized, driving home, had never once actually come on because there'd never been anything wrong to trigger it, staying dark the entire way. I picked Nadia up from her grandmother's that evening in my own truck, on time, for the first time in 3 weeks. She asked why I was smiling at nothing. I told her the truck was just running really well. I didn't tell her the rest. She was 7. Some things you let a kid learn later once they're old enough to understand that sometimes the good guys just need better paperwork.